I'm going to be beginning the first part of the course that moves us into the different theorists with an introduction to social theory, so a kind of overarching look at some of the forces and thinkers that led to the development of sociology as we now understand it. And it's only really a fairly recent phenomenon that sociology was seen as this completely distinct discipline. It emerges out of economics and philosophy, and also all of the social tensions that were occurring beginning in the 19th century. And I'll be talking more about that as we go along. So, in this section, this is offering you that kind of context I talked about in the introductory lecture, so that you have some sense that sociology just didn't drop from the heavens, that it came out of very particular social forces. And that is also the reason why it becomes somewhat difficult to apply sociology outside of a Western context. Now, obviously, sociologists can come from anywhere, but it would seem logical that it would have to look quite different if you're looking at, say, Thai society, which is still based on a monarchy. So, so this is very much a Western cultural phenomenon, and then it gets taken into the kind of academic system. So we'll be looking at some of its precursors shortly. So just a note, I am going to be following, as I said, the chronology of the textbook. I think it's just easier to do that to keep us all kind of in alignment, and so it's not confusing, because this is a lot of information and I'm kind of picking and choosing. So as you will probably know, another professor will probably highlight different things than I'm highlighting, and that's why the textbook is good, so that you have an overview. And there's just too much information to cover it all. So I'm going to be highlighting certain people and ideas as we move along here, and different social phenomenon, and based on Mann's textbook. So you can sort of follow along for that from that first chapter of An Introduction to Social Theory. So I want to begin with the question of what is modernity, because really, when we talk about sociology, we're talking about something that emerges out of modernity and co-creates modernity. And this is one of those terms that means certain things and everything, and we have to be careful when we're... So I do want to define it, and this is something that we do in the academy, is define something before we start talking about it. So what do we mean by modernity and the modern? It has a very specific meaning within the study of sociology. And sociology is definitely a child of modernity. So it shares a lot of those characteristics, both positive and negative. And so I will be talking about that more as we move through the lecture. There is a kind of a triumphal kind of attitude within modernity, I would say, that builds on humanism and builds on kind of ideas coming from the Renaissance, which really place human beings, specifically men, we can talk about that when we get to the other sections on feminism, but sort of humanity at the center of the narrative. And this, of course, is kind of increasingly moving religion to the margins. Now, I've already talked in the introduction about the fact that never completely happened. I will be looking at the French case, where it's probably the purest example of modernity, and looking at the difference in its attitude to religion, and which is actually echoed in Quebec in the Canadian case. So what is it? So it is the emergence of ideas that, as I said, largely, now again, not always, but mostly reject religion. And so what comes of this is often the framing of all the period before modernity as the Dark Ages. And some of you will have heard this kind of language. And often when people talk about the medieval period, they actually refer to it as the Dark Age, which is not accurate, as any medieval historian will tell you. And so modernity sees itself as a kind of a cutting off. Now, this is actually not true historically. There's, societies evolve, they don't just rupture in that way. But modernity has always understood itself as a kind of a cutting away from previous ways of being. And so it typically rejects religion, typically rejects monarchy as a form of government. And so we're going to look at that. Now, again, we need to always problematize that, because if we look at countries like Denmark and Sweden, they still have monarchies, even though they're extremely modern in that sense. So there's never been sort of a perfect model of this. So I don't want to go too far back. I mean, we have to make a kind of a cutoff point when the period we're talking about. So I'm going to be looking at it from kind of the 19th century, late 19th century. So what we see is a rise in the power of science. Now, we have to be very careful here not to get trapped in kind of reading ourselves back onto history. This is not science the way that we understand it today. But nonetheless, we see an increasing power within the idea of the scientific method, ideas of objectivity and empiricism. So this flies in the face of kind of religious narratives of meaning. And when we get to Durkheim, we can talk about some of the problems that ends up causing. So this idea that we can explain the world through science and through rational theorizing is at the very basis of disciplines like sociology. And so we see, I'll be talking about this more, but the rise of bureaucracy as well. So the idea that we can consciously, rationally organize society rather than it being a feudal system that's based on kind of the monarchy and landed aristocracy and these feudal relationships. And so increasingly the idea is that we should be able to use science in order, and also technology eventually, to sort of engineer the perfect society. Now, living where we are, we're privileged or not to know how badly wrong these are utopian schemes, without a doubt. And as somebody very attracted to utopia, I can attest to the problems that are innate within it. And so I'll touch on this as we go along, but I don't want to present this in that triumphal way that it's often presented. So we see the rise of nation states. We see the rise of colonialism also. So modernity is emerging out of these changes within the social, economic, political orders. So the modern age, we usually start it with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, that larger kind of philosophical movement that was influential across Europe and what becomes the United States and Canada. And I would say it had more power in the United States than in Canada, and that is partly why Canada developed quite differently. But definitely the Enlightenment influenced the whole Western world. And so we see these philosophers and economists beginning, as I said, to really separate themselves away from religion and religious understandings of the world. So just to give an example, traditionally Christianity has had a lot to say about money, for instance, often very negative things, and sort of controls on usury and borrowing and the sumptuary laws and so on. And we start to see this movement of economics breaking away from the church and developing ideas of the free market. So that obviously becomes extremely important. We also see great strides in medicine, and this is one of the reasons why in the early part of the modern period we do see a lot of triumphalism, because science and medicine made huge strides during this period. There's no doubt about it. And so it was seen as things were just going to get better and better. So we see the modern as emerging from the scientific revolution. So that idea of quote unquote objective research being done, and which moves us into the current period where the idea of double blind research. Now that again can be problematized, and I do that in my health and healing course. But just let's leave it with that for now. So that idea that you can have these experiments, and so this shapes the whole idea of how science and research is going to move forward. And it also shapes how sociology understands itself. And I've had this discussion with colleagues that it often seems like sociology has a kind of scientific inferiority complex, that in the early days it wanted to be a science. And so now, as we know, it sits in social sciences, but it has a lot of connections with anthropology and other humanities. And so it's always been this uncomfortable tension where some branches of sociology tend to see themselves as a science, and others see themselves more in line with humanities, and that's an ongoing tension. Nothing wrong with that. And so we can see also that the incredible turmoil within the political world was influencing all of these changes. And so we see the American and then the French revolutions. Now we have to be, again, clear here that these are very different revolutions. And in the American case, they did not reject religion. So many of you will know the idea that there's a separation of church and state, but certainly what we see in the American case is actually religion retains a tremendous amount of power, and anybody who watches the news will know that is still the case. Also, we see the creation of really, the United States is the home of most of the world's what we call new religious traditions. So the Americans did not go down the road of trying to get rid of religion, which we're going to see is certainly the way Marxism takes it, and the French Revolution tends to take it. The Americans just want to make sure that it's not, or they try to, it doesn't really work, keep it out of politics and economics. And so in the American case, we see it developing quite differently from the French, and I can talk about that more as we go along. We also see how this impacts sociology. So Durkheim's concerns, being somebody born in France, are very different than, say, sociologists in North America. Just as a final note, modernity also connects to artistic and cultural movements in writing, art, and architecture. So this is a kind of a very influential movement that influences all aspects of culture. I don't want to overstate this. Modernists tend to feel like it became the only sort of approach. That's never been true. There were many people who still retained a kind of traditional or religious worldview, but certainly it was extremely influential in all of these different aspects of society. It's very important to note when looking at these social currents that all of these countries and cultures were in conversation with one another. So in your textbook, Mann talks about the Scottish Enlightenment. So this Enlightenment process was taking place across the Western world, and it looked different in different countries. So the Scottish Enlightenment has been extremely influential, and Mann dates it from the 1740 to 1820. And so Scotland itself was going through major political changes. Some of you may know about the sort of the enclosing of the Highlands, and so huge numbers of the Scottish population in the Highlands were displaced, many of whom came to Canada and participated in Canadian culture. And also with these forces of enclosure in Scotland and England, we see the creation of the landless poor, which has a huge impact in what is to come. And also the beginnings of the ultimate breakdown of feudal and tribal society in Scotland. So this Enlightenment was centered in the university towns of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen, and drew on the thinking of, for instance, the French Enlightenment, but brought their own kind of approach to it. And so as Mann writes on page 9, the Scots thought that they could best understand our present social conditions by introducing principles of order into the welter of historical, social, and economic facts. Okay, and so they particularly focused on the role of property and how we understand property shapes society. And so we're going to see that this is also very influential moving into Marxist theory. And so we get Adam Smith, who's probably the single most important economist in history, that's still held up by many Americans as sort of the progenitor of laissez-faire economics. This isn't completely true to Adam Smith, but that's for economists to debate. But Adam Smith and many of these other members of the Scottish Enlightenment are really focusing on economics and property. And so I just want to highlight here right off the bat how this becomes the seeds of a problem. And so when the colonization of Canada starts, we find people, often Scottish people, coming into contact with Indigenous nations that have no concept of private property in this way. And so this assumption that this is the way it is becomes highly problematic, and we're dealing with that right now with land claims in Canada, and an ongoing kind of misunderstanding between settler cultures who have these ideas of private property and cultures that don't, or don't understand it in that way. Another important aspect of the Scottish Enlightenment is the idea of dividing historical time into stages. The Enlightenment thinkers love doing this. It's really problematic now looking back. Certainly when I'm teaching anthropological theory, we see the same thing. And so obviously now we have to look at it as important, but we also have to problematize it. So he starts out, they start out with the idea of the primitive. And so obviously this language is a problem right off the top. And early anthropology also uses this. So the idea of calling subsistence cultures primitive. And so part of this is part of the progress narrative that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, that all societies are moving towards becoming basically like Western society. And again, this has huge implications for what we now call development. Is that in fact true? Does every single society on Earth have to look like ours? I would say no. But certainly from the point of view of these thinkers, there's only one proper way, and we're moving towards it, and that's towards rationality science and so on. So according to the Scottish Enlightenment, we move from primitive to pastoral to agrarian to exchange and commercial. So they're glossing this shift that's happening as something that is extremely positive and moving us towards, quote unquote, the truth. Okay, and when we get to Weber, I'll be talking a lot more about how he looks at how Protestantism is influencing these attitudes towards money, and certainly the Scottish Enlightenment is Protestant, and I'll talk about that more. But we still see this. People might not use the word primitive anymore, but there's certainly the idea that I would say still very common that our way of doing things is the pinnacle, and that all of the world's societies basically should sort of be brought on board. Of course, now we would say this is a form of kind of cultural ethnocentricity and trying to assimilate others to our own way of being. But at the time, this was just seen as the truth. I want to look now briefly at Thomas Paine, and many of you will know or have heard of Thomas Paine. He's one of the most influential thinkers in Western society. And so he was English, but ended up being centrally involved in the American Revolution. And so Paine was writing about revolutionary France and America, and in a very sympathetic way. So he was a highly controversial figure. So England at this time, with its central role as a kind of a world empire, is being shaken by all of these storms around it. And again, I can't go into too much detail, but Britain tries to walk a kind of middle road and work towards reform rather than revolution, because and I think there's good reason for, I'm sympathetic to this. As one of my teachers in high school said, once you let the bullet loose, it's very hard to put it back. And so certainly both the American and French revolutions were extremely violent and led to further violence later on. So there's truth in that. There's no doubt about it. So Thomas Paine was trying to kind of defend these revolutionary thinkers to people in England, and then eventually he moves to the United States. So in 1791, Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet, and pamphlets were one of the key ways, and this goes right into the Victorian period, in which people, they could be, churned out very quickly and reach thousands of people. And so pamphlets were one of the key ways that various political groups communicated with each other and with others and argued and so on. And so pamphlets like this were extremely, extremely influential, and this is probably one of the most famous and important ever written. And so he writes in reaction, again, to these revolutionary movements. And so he says, the laws of every country must be analogous to some common principle. So this is the idea of the rule of law, that it's not just the whim of a politician, makes you think, doesn't it, right now? The whim of a politician or a monarch or someone who's in between, to just come up with things. There has to be an orderly common principle. And so this is at the very heart of modernity and the Enlightenment, this idea that of principles. You're not just doing things out of impulse or feeling. It's out of abstract principle. In England, no parent or master, nor all the authority of Parliament, omnipotent as it is called itself, can bind or control the personal freedom, even of an individual beyond the age of 21 years. On what ground or right, then, could Parliament of 1688 or any other Parliament bind all posterity forever? Okay, so he's basically saying that parliaments work for the will of the people. So again, he's undercutting the monarchy here. Now, obviously, England maintained its monarchy and still Canada is a constitutional monarchy. But certainly the powers have been completely marginalized. And so this is the beginning. And so Paine is basically saying no one has the right to bind or control an adult person's rights. They have to be taken into account in any form of government. Also, these change over time. And I find this very interesting because when I watch the American discussion about their constitution, I think they treat it more like scripture, like it can't be changed. But actually, Paine is saying the exact opposite, that each generation has to change and update its laws to suit what's going on at the time. So there's no sort of one unchanging law. So this undercuts certainly ideas of monarchy, the divine right of kings, and so on. This is also a foundational document that brings us into very contemporary ideas of human rights, and so general human rights. Now, it's no mistake he's saying the rights of man. I suspect Paine was not thinking about women, and we're going to look at Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes in reaction to this about the rights of women. So we'll get to that. But for now, let's just look at what he's saying. So this idea of universal human rights. Now, obviously, this is called into question immediately, where we look at the founders of the American Republic who are slave owners. So when we talk about rights, we're talking about rights of very certain people. Nonetheless, this is the seeds of something very revolutionary. And this is what I would say our society would not, sort of the best of our society would not exist without this idea of universal human rights. And so in the case of Paine's tract, this gets expanded over time. And so people obviously logically say, well, then what about the rights of women? And what about the rights of enslaved people? Isn't everybody equal? And this is an ongoing conversation, obviously, because no society has been able to get it completely right where everyone's completely equal. But we've certainly seen huge strides being made in many different societies towards full equality. And so you have to have the idea first. And so Paine is one of the first who starts to sketch this idea out. And this leads, you can follow this line directly to things like the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So as has already been touched on, the political turmoil that is happening as a result of these philosophies and people taking them seriously and trying to bring them into actual politics is fundamental to the shaping of how social theory and sociology develops. And so we need to really recognize that, the context of what these people were involved in. And many of the French thinkers were actively involved in the French Revolution. Some of them died as a result. And so this is not somebody sitting in a room somewhere just thinking lofty thoughts. These are people that were actively engaged in political change. And we're going to see that sociology over time starts to develop into these two streams. One that's sort of more critical and is aiming at social change, and one that's more about social cohesion. And we can talk about that more as next week. But certainly, particularly the French Revolution, I talked already about the American Revolution is a little different. But the French Revolution is directly related to how sociology ends up developing. And so we can see, for instance, that Durkheim is looking back on the changes as a result of the French Revolution and questioning some of the problems. So there's that early triumphal period, and then people like Durkheim are questioning, and that goes on into the present. How does this social configuration, how does it impact socially, and what are the sort of the negatives and the positives of that? And how do we build a better society becomes really the central question. When we're talking about the discipline of sociology and social theory more generally, we have to talk about Auguste Comte, who is a French philosopher very deeply involved in the French Revolution, and who is associated with coining the term sociology itself. And so he's really at the very heart of it. And it's interesting to look at his personal background, because he came from a very royalist and Roman Catholic family. And this was often the case with these philosophes and these revolutionaries. And so they're also in direct conflict with their own families a lot of the time. And so Comte was one of the first to believe that you could organize society scientifically. Okay, and so this idea that you can scientifically organize the state. And we see echoes of this in all Western countries, and also within Marxism, that idea of making 5-year plans or 10-year plans for your state. So you don't just let things evolve, you're organizing it through your bureaucracy. So this is very much coming from Comte and the idea of a positive philosophy. So he wrote a number of very influential works. He himself studied philosophy and history. So as I was saying earlier, all of this comes out of what we would now call the humanities. So it's Comte really that wants to put it on a scientific footing. Now, as I said earlier, this never completely happens. There are some people within sociology, or sort of what we would call quantitative sociology, that deal entirely with statistics. So they would probably see themselves as sitting more within the sciences, but you have to interpret those statistics. And so that moves us into much more kind of social sciences, humanities. But Comte had that kind of very utopian idea that we could organize the perfect society scientifically. In reading on Comte, I found out that apparently he was fighting with everybody, including the people he worked for and his family. So you can see these ideas, a lot of these thinkers were coming into conflict with many people in their own societies. He lost his job eventually, as many of these kind of people do, speaking truth to power, and also not the most diplomatic personalities. So he's considered to be the founder of positivism and deeply influenced the Anglo tradition as well. His works were translated into English and influenced England and North America. So again, the idea of positivism, and so this is sort of just common sense to many people. I had a kind of a humorous interchange with a colleague at Nipissing who's in the sciences, and one day she came up to me and she said, I realized I'm a positivist. And so I laughed and I said, yeah. And I think that part of it is in our current society, for many people, this is just the way it is. This is just truth. It's not a philosophical position. But in fact, it is a philosophical position. So what is it? It's the idea that we can use data and quote unquote facts, and that should be the only thing we use to construct theories of the world, and how we act should be based on that. So this is a very intellectual, it brackets out any other aspects of the human person. So this is very much that kind of Cartesian approach of I think, therefore I am. It's all about thought. There's no idea about emotions. There's no idea about metaphysics or spirituality, that everything is just data and evidence, and that's how you organize things. And so obviously, this leads to a very predictable backlash in the Romantic movement, where members of the Romantic movement, artists, poets, philosophers, are trying to bring back other aspects of the human person, including the emotional and the spiritual. But Comte was a positivist. He felt that this science and rational thought should be the basis of organizing society. So he writes in 1822, plan for the scientific work necessary to reorganize society. So he goes way down the rabbit hole with this of trying to organize a whole society with his mind. And you can see again that rupture, that it's as though there's no continuity within French society. He's just going to create this new thing. Now that, as I've said earlier, can never work. Many have tried, no one has succeeded, because that's not how human beings function. And it causes a huge amount of trouble if you try to do that. So I'll talk about that more when we get to the Marxist system. So I'll just give an example of this. So Comte comes out, we've done away with religion. Okay, so let's redo the whole calendar. So you will know, I think most of you, that within Western civilization, generally the calendar is based on Christian holidays, and it still is. We just had one. So he's like, we'll do away with this and we'll replace all of these religious figures with, philosophers. And so we'll have days where we celebrate these philosophers. Now, the Marxists did a similar thing where they tried to kind of create a cult around Chairman Mao or around Stalin. I think we know now how incredibly dangerous this is. But this was early days, and Comte was a great utopian, and so he develops this calendar. Now, I think you'd be willing to bet money this is just a complete failure, because people have been following this religious calendar for thousands of years, and so it doesn't work. And so this is an example of the way you can think of something with your mind, but how does it actually function within society becomes the question. And so he asks this very important question, and this is really at the heart of it all here. How does one reorganize human life irrespective of God and king? And so these are these two revolutions that remove religion from that very powerful place at the center and remove the monarchy. And so he's asking the question then, how do we organize things if we've rejected those fundamental building blocks of society? And so for other people like him, that becomes the question. And so really social theory just emerges from that, and we get a variety of answers. And so the various people in thought we're going to be looking at in this course are often addressing this question of how to build. There's a generally optimistic, humanistic element within most sociology, in my opinion, that idea that we should be developing society for the good of the people in it, and how do we go about doing that? So Comte, like so many of the others, was just loved the idea of creating stages of humanity. This is something that we don't do anymore. So again, I just want to really gloss this as of its time. This was a very common way of understanding the world, and again, linked to that notion of progress, which I'll be talking about in a moment. And so in your textbook on page 12, he talks about this. So the first stage, according to Comte, is the theological, when everything is explained by divine powers or supernatural beings, which are given concrete shape through the symbolism and image of the priestly caste. This period is dominated by priests and military leaders. And so you could say like feudal kind of system. And I spend a lot of time when I'm teaching religious studies debunking this idea that this is something primitive or barbaric, something from the past, which is often how it is kind of glossed within modernity, something from the Dark Ages, as I said earlier. The second phase for him, why he chooses metaphysical, I'm not clear. The divine powers become abstract essences or forces. This was, roughly speaking, the early modern period, when religious leaders and lawyers dominated. I assume he's talking about his own period here, where we start to see things like abstract principles of the rights of man, for instance. And then the third, being positive, Empirical facts and scientific laws only are used to explain all phenomenon. In this stage, industrial administration and scientific moral guides will dominate. Okay. And so this has huge implications, this idea that in this coming period, we move into a time where we just use science and rational thought to organize society. And it has had a huge influence, obviously, on our society and much of the world, actually. So now we come to the idea of progress, which I've been alluding to throughout this lecture. And this is one of the most influential ideas in all of Western culture, and it continues into the present, and I can talk a little bit about that. So Antoine de Condorcet was a mathematician, philosopher, and social theorist. Again, like Kant, very involved within the ideas of the French Revolution. He himself, you may know, there were all these different factions within this movement, and so some wanted, for instance, the execution of the king. He was a more moderate person. He did not call for that. And so he fell afoul of the more radical part of the French Revolution himself, which is very dangerous for a person. And so he was eventually jailed and died under mysterious circumstances. So Condorcet, being a mathematician and wanted to apply the scientific method to social and political thought. This was his idea. And so he understood human society in terms of different stages of improvement, same as Comte. And so the idea that humanity is always progressing and moving towards the truth. And I remember many years ago when I was an undergraduate, my professor debunked this in front of the class, and this was one of those mind-blowing moments in university where it had never occurred to me, because this is such a subconscious part of I would say Canadian society and Western society in general, that we're moving towards this glorious tomorrow, and we can see it all the time in the Human Genome Project, and every time new technology comes out, this is going to be the thing. AI is going to be the thing that changes everything. It's going to be amazing. Now, of course, we're becoming much more skeptical about this. At least I hope so. But certainly, it's still lying underneath this kind of, I would say, unsubstantiated optimism that we're moving towards something better, as though our actions aren't going to contribute to that. And so Condorcet was one of the key thinkers in this idea of progress. And so he's quoted in your textbook on page 11, to show by appeal to reason and fact that nature has set no term to the perfection of human faculties, that the perfectibility of man is truly indefinite, and the progress of this perfectibility from now onwards independent of any power of the might wish to halt it. So the idea that we can just be perfecting ourselves constantly. And you can see this in many aspects of our culture. I'm fascinated by, for instance, this whole culture of YouTubers and perfectibility and getting up at 4 a.m. and sticking your face in a bowl of ice, as though we can perfect our schedule and our body and our mind, very much coming out of the machine model also. And so there's this kind of driving force within modernity and the idea of progress. So as I said, this has come under much more scrutiny as a result of the many wars we've had and the atomic bomb, and we've come to question things like technology. Is it always good? But certainly in his period, it was this very utopian view of all of these new things. And so again, this has now been criticized for its ethnocentric bias. So the idea that of progress, really, these stages that I've been talking about, they always assume that these other cultures are stuck in these other stages, and that it's only Western society that has come into the light. And it can be used and has been used to justify things like colonialism. The next vital piece of the puzzle is the Industrial Revolution, and I'm sure many of you have already studied this in various classes, but it's impossible to overemphasize the huge change. Really, in many ways, this was the biggest change, I would argue, or at least equal in terms of the political change. And so this changes social structures. It changes our relationship to the natural environment. So he writes in your textbook, this was the general result of the Industrial Revolution was that human beings went from small scale production of things by hand to the mass scale production of things by machine. Okay, and so that seems very, it's easy to say that, but the actual revolutionary change of that, as I said, can't be overstated. There's a moment in Middlemarch by George Eliot where the town is arguing about there's a railroad that's going to be coming through their town, and everybody's up in arms. Will this be good or will this be bad? And so that's an example of the way that the railroad completely changes, starting with English society and then most societies on Earth. The way transportation, the way we move through the landscape changes completely as a result of the machine age. It also organizes our work days. It's been interesting to see with the changes that COVID brought about, where people were able to work at home. We've actually seen a sort of society-wide discussion of whether we need to maintain what is basically the factory model, where we all sit in a chair or standing for X number of hours a day for pay. Could there be other ways of organizing labor, for instance? So many of you will know that prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people were either farmers or they were part of cottage industry, where they worked as weavers, for instance, within their homes. So labor was sort of organized in a completely different way. And so this then leads into kind of logically into Fordist ideas of the assembly line. And what we now know are these very alienating ways of approaching human labor. So the Industrial Revolution impacts everything: the economy, human relationships, the way cities are laid out, transportation, the environment, all of it. So with the Industrial Revolution, we see capitalism, which had already existed, that kind of market economy, but is expanded exponentially, and leads to all of these other knock-on effects that completely impact social theory. And so I touched on the idea of enclosure. There are many examples of this, but where people are taken from the land either by force or they're forced off the land because they need to make money. And so we see this exodus from the agricultural areas into urban centers. And of course, this completely changes society. We also see the phenomenon of extreme poverty. And so it's a strange thing where when we look back to the Dark Ages, at least at that time, if you had some land you could or the commons, not all land was held privately, you would have a cow and you would have milk and you could grow your own vegetables. So kind of subsistence economies existed. And so if things went badly, you always had enough to eat, or you usually had enough to eat. But what we see with capitalism is huge number of people become landless poor, and so they pour into the cities looking for wage labor. So this is a completely radical change to society, and much of social theory that develops, certainly Marxist social theory, is dealing with this problem of urban poverty that's unleashed by the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. So we also see global empires, which had obviously pre-existed in the Industrial Revolution, but they develop, again, through science and technology exponentially. And so we also see trade networks being developed on the basis of colonization and increasingly on the basis of slavery. And I was reading and listening to a Canadian Trinidadian writer-poet who's talking about how she was an English major and how reading the fiction of England in the 1800s, she can't ignore. There'll be little bits in Jane Austen, little bits in different kind of Regency Victorian fiction about the fortunes of people. And she said, I can't get past the fact, so Dion Brand is African background. She's like, I can't get past the fact that this money is coming from slavery. They never say it. They'll refer to the West Indies, but they don't actually explicitly say these large country houses were often being financed through slavery. So we see also, obviously, in the American case, this is so contentious it leads into the Civil War. So I touched on this already, the idea of urbanization, and so the fact that increasing numbers of people are living in cities, and in the case of countries like Canada, the vast majority of people now live in cities, and that's increasingly true around the world. And so this completely changes and reshapes society. We also see, on a related note, changes to social and family structures and the true end of feudalism. And so I've often said in classes, you just need to look back to your grandparents, great grandparents, to know that prior to, I'd say, the mid 20th century, late 20th century, moving around was not possible for people. And this is still true in much of the world. They don't have the money and they don't have the ability to move around. You're attached to your place, to your community, to your religion, and that's how it is. And so there's obviously positive and negative related to that. And certainly we see changes in family structure. So many of you will know that farming communities often depend on large-scale family labor. We see a movement towards the nuclear family of just parents and children, and then increasingly in our time period, households of one person. So this process of it becoming smaller and smaller, kind of. And this is also related to the need for social mobility for labor reasons. And certainly if you look into your family backgrounds, if I look into mine, on my mother's side, they moved to Canada for jobs, right? So you left your country of origin for a job, and so we see these forces being unleashed that are really shaking family structures, and certainly we are living with the collateral damage of that within our societies, and I think we're really starting to look at that. And I've, for instance, read various articles about the way in which people now actually think about whether they want to take a different job, even if it pays more, if it takes them away from extended family who might help them with childcare, for example. But of course, for many people, there wasn't a lot of choice involved. If you're in extreme poverty, you're going to go where the job is. And I always like to ask my students, would you move across the country for your quote unquote dream job? It's still a perplexing question, and it's still true even within Canada that I've heard people say in North Bay that they wish that their children could stay in North Bay, but they have to go away for work. So this completely shakes up the family structure. It also leads to changes in attitudes around gender, and so we see the rise of what in the Victorian period was called the new woman. And so influenced by people like Paine and these revolutions, increasing numbers of women are insisting on becoming educated. You probably know that women weren't permitted to go to university until the late 1800s in most Western countries. And so we start to see a first generation of women in the late 1800s who become educated and then move into work in which they can financially support themselves. And so this obviously radically changes society, and it continues to into the present. And I'll look at that in more detail when we get to the section on feminist sociology. Another key thinker within the development of what becomes sociology is an English woman named Harriet Martineau. And she is pretty much ignored within your textbook. This was one of my criticisms of this textbook. He's very, very, there's very little about sort of gender and women in this textbook, but I'm going to add it in. So Harriet Martineau, like many people at that time, we don't have this strict division between disciplines, and so she was an essayist, novelist, journalist, and a historical writer. And so she wrote novels, she wrote tracts, and one of her most famous work was actually a translation from French into English of the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte. So she was very influenced by thinkers from the French Revolution like Comte, and her thought develops, as is usually the case, over time, and she becomes increasingly more of a skeptic, for instance, towards religion. Martineau has been referred to as the mother of sociology, so she is often included along with people like Comte, Durkheim, Weber, Marx as kind of foundational pillars of sociology. And she was a pioneer of political economy, sociology, anti-slavery, and women's rights. So clearly one of these new women who was educated enough to begin to question things around her, and being a woman questioning her own status within society. She's very similar in certain ways to Mary Wollstonecraft, who I'll be talking about in more detail in the section on feminist sociology. So Martineau makes the logical leap, as did the first wave feminists in the United States, who were often abolitionists. So they were opposed to slavery, seeing it, a lot of them were religious and believed it was immoral. And so for many of these women who were involved, very deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, they began to question their own lack of rights. So this idea, we're fighting for this, for full rights for slaves, but what about full rights for women? So this sort of galvanizes what becomes various parts of the feminist movement. So she was deeply involved with all of these aspects of sort of trying to develop a more egalitarian society. So she wrote How to Observe Methods and Manners in 1838. Which is considered to be one of the first attempts at a sociological method. So this is where we're really starting to move towards what we would now recognize as sociology, which the idea that you need to use observation, you need to have a certain technique and method. It isn't just like philosophical writing, and it has its own separate kind of disciplinary structure and methodology. And so she expands the focus of sociology, and this becomes extremely influential in various schools of critical sociology to look at religion, social class, domestic relations, and social institutions. So she becomes one of the first to really look not just at huge systems like political systems, but start to look at the family systems and so on, and how power works within communities, within families, within classes. And so she's probably the most important pioneer of that type of sociology. So it's important to note, alongside the sort of the political, economic aspects of social thought, is the influence of modernism on arts and letters and culture. And so, as with all social movements, it impacts all these aspects of society. So that can include architecture, can include fine art, can include writing. And so many of you will know this if you studied English. There are sort of modern writers like James Joyce or Hemingway. It's associated with a very particular style of architecture. And so we associate, for instance, mid-century modern, that kind of no embellishment, no ornamentation, everything's very sleek and clean, those kind of lines. They all come out of this kind of modernist aesthetic. And it partakes also of the idea of that rupture, that this is a break with the past. And we're going to see that postmodernism takes it one better by breaking with modernism, or so they say. But certainly that energy is in it. Again, that triumphalist energy of we're getting rid of all that old stuff. And so if we just give the example of Picasso, rejecting the idea of painting landscapes or painting in a way that's more almost like photographic, the idea that you can do abstract art is coming out of modernism. So that idea of questioning everything, and that questioning of tradition, that's all a huge part of it. And so that this is one of the key aspects, along with that myth of progress, is the idea of questioning tradition and rejecting tradition is very much at the heart of modern movements, and the idea that things can be changed. Now, again, it's debatable whether that's always for the better. Certainly within art, people have many things to say about it. But I do want to say that I certainly know many people that are modern in their worldview, and they don't sit around thinking that. But if you look at the way they approach the world, there's still many, many people in our society that, for instance, believe in the myth of progress. They believe that technology is going to solve all our problems. They reject any form of tradition as kind of something that binds and oppresses us. They reject religion. They reject various forms of authority within society. And so this is still alive and well. Obviously, it's come under much more criticism as we've seen some of the problematic aspects of it. So I would say that modernism kind of hits its height in the kind of the 50s and 60s, and then starts to come under criticism with the new countercultural movements that lead us into environmentalism and back to the land and second wave feminism and so on. But certainly modernity has its field day from kind of the late 18th century to 1950s or so. At the end of this chapter in your textbook on page 16, I think he captures this very well, this sort of tension within modernism. And he calls it triumphant versus alienated modernism. And I had never seen that before, and I think that's a good way of kind of looking at that. So the idea that there's a stream of modernism that calls for the embracing of modern science, technology, and political life and worships the machine. So certainly this is alive and well, and I know this. So if you say things like, okay, you want nuclear power, where are you going to put the waste? That gets waved away, that somehow magically technology is going to solve that. Don't ask that question, just accept it. And so anybody who doesn't kind of get on the train of this is called a Luddite, standing in the way of progress, and so on. And this is definitely alive and well, and is often used as a way to shut down critique, in my experience. So, and again, that triumphalism is just, you just accept that it's amazing and that you shouldn't question it, which seems to me counterintuitive if we're talking about using abstract thought and reason. Shouldn't we be able to ask these questions? So the other type is alienated modernism, which sees modern humanity as cut off and fragmented, and the idea of progress as is questioned. The power of science and technology are viewed as morally ambiguous. So this also obviously exists in our society now, and we can see it coming to fruition in various environmental movements. And I do want to talk about various social movements that we're seeing in the present, such as frugality and minimalism and so on. There's a lot of really interesting kind of philosophical work being done in those areas. And to me, they are a critique of modernism and postmodernism. So this kind of seeking for meaning, seeking for purpose, trying to get back into a proper relationship with the environment, all of these things. So I think we're still living in the tension of this, of triumphant and alienated modernism. So just to give an example of what this can look like, and some of its very obvious problems is included in the textbook, looking at the futurist movement, and it's very related to avant-garde and that idea of being shocking. This is still, there's a lot of artists that do this, where they want to do something that shocks. How you think you can do that in the current time period, I don't know, but it's still sort of an idea of sort of modernist style artists. So when we look at the futurists, we see a real tendency towards manifestos. So as soon as I see a manifesto, I'm like, So this written in 1909 by Marinetti, and so I've just taken a portion of it. I'm going to read some of it aloud. I didn't want to write it down because it's so disturbing to me, but so this part isn't quite as disturbing. We affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. We want to hymn the man at the wheel who hurls the lance of his spirit across the earth. And I think this really captures the energy of this type of modernism, that idea of being in love with speed. There's no reason for it. It's fun, it's interesting, it's stimulating. And we can really see that in our culture, that it's all about speed and convenience and kind of stimulation. And so this is very much already there in 1909 in Marinetti's manifesto, that we're just supposed to get on board with this. So if we go further down on page 17, except in the struggle, there is no more beauty. No work without an aggressive character can be a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent attack on unknown forces to reduce and prostrate them before man. Okay, so this actually has echoes in certain types of Renaissance humanism, but he's taking it into the kind of mechanical age. And I think it's pretty clear the levels of aggression in this that are just below the surface, that everything comes through struggle, that struggle in itself is beautiful. And I find this particularly interesting. Violent attack against unknown forces. How does one do that? This is where the language gets very disturbing for me. Then he's more explicit here. We will glorify war. Now this is just years before the First World War, so it's doubly disturbing. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene. So likening war to hygiene, like cleansing and purifying. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for woman. Okay, so as Mann talks about in your textbook, this is proto-fascism very clearly. That idea of violence, kind of irrational violence, that's kind of beautiful and purifying, and certainly the complete denigration of women. We see that in all fascist regimes. And as Guillermo del Toro says in one of his movies, I believe it's Pan's Labyrinth, when he was talking about that movie, that fascism is a boys' game. And so we can see it within modernism. Some of these energies are very positive and utopian and are going to lead to positive change, and others go in a much different direction that leads us into fascism. So, as I said in the previous slide, this is intention, and it continues to be intention in our world today. I want to end this lecture by looking at the chart that Mann includes on page 21 of your textbook. And I actually think this is very helpful. And this is one of the reasons why I chose this textbook, because he's very good at creating some order within all of this material, because I think you're already seeing there's a lot of material, a lot of thinkers. And I'm not saying this is the only way to organize it, but other texts that I've looked at, it just gives you, a writing by this person, a writing by that person. And it's very hard to understand where they fit within the context of sociology. So this is helpful. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it. So he's creating a map here, and he divides it into social consensus versus social conflict. And he includes different thinkers within these different schools of thought. So he puts Max Weber under social conflict, which is interesting to me. I don't know if I agree with that, but certainly he puts Durkheim within social cohesion, which I can see. Durkheim we're going to talk about this in much more detail, but very concerned with social cohesion. So as he says on page 22, he himself said this is a simplification to map it out like this, but we're not going to be looking at all these thinkers. They're all included in here. I'm going to be highlighting certain ones, as I've already been doing. So he says on page 22, we can make a second basic distinction in the understanding of society based on whether the theorist sees consensus or conflict as the core of social life. So a very obvious example is Karl Marx is based in a conflictual view of society, that these forces are always jockeying for power and influence and economic power. While others, like Talcott Parsons, are much more about let's maintain the harmony of society. Now, it's interesting to look at this kind of from a macro level, which is what we should be doing in university, which is, in my experience, this often comes down to temperament and personality, which school you slot into. And so certainly you could even just put this on a kind of a political spectrum. So if someone was a red Tory conservative, they would probably be much more interested in social cohesion and theories that have to do with keeping everything running the way it is. Now, if I'm looking at it critically, I would say, well, the status quo suits you. If you're an upper middle class person, this status quo suits you. So of course you're interested in social cohesion. Now that's simplistic, because as we're going to see with Durkheim, that was not his reasoning. His worry was the breakdown of society and how it would impact on people. So there's many things that go into that, but I do think that this is an interesting and useful way of looking at it, that sociologists do tend to fall into one camp or the other. And it even maps onto how sociology is used in society. So often sociologists have been trained to work for the government, work in bureaucracy, and sort of keep that all moving. And that's not to say that they're not, that they don't care about the good of society. So in the the post that I put for the first week, there's a Canadian sociology text where the writers actually talk about Blishen, who I'm ashamed to say I had never heard of. I know who Tommy Douglas is, obviously, but Blishen was a sociologist that was working for the Canadian government, who they hired to look at the plan that had been used in Saskatchewan under Tommy Douglas in the CCF and see if we could do it for all of Canada and create universal health care in Canada. And so the sociologist came back and said, yes, we should do this. So there's an example of somebody who's working within an organization, within a bureaucracy that's actually trying to improve society and succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams. So we have to be careful here with these black and white definitions. But I do think it's useful to look at it, to use this as a kind of an organizing schemata. And so we will be looking at a number of these thinkers as we move along. So this also often has to do with whether the scholar is what we now call an engaged scholar or somebody who sees scholarship as just purely empirical observation. I would argue that if we go right back to Comte, all of these thinkers were deeply involved in politics. And so but I have experienced this in my own life. For many academics, they want to live it. They're teaching it because they believe in creating a better world. So it often comes down to temperament of the individual. So the other important kind of binary here, as we're looking out onto this now developed field of sociology, and many of you will already be familiar with this because I believe most of you have already taken the introduction to sociology, is the idea of the micro versus the macro. And so the focus on the individual versus the social structure. And this has, again, been a huge tension within sociology. And I have to say, I don't accept these binaries. I've used theory from all these different thinkers depending on what the problem is. So as I said at the very beginning, I'm much more of the toolbox theory. If it works for this problem, let's use it, rather than saying I'm in this camp and I'm only about social consensus, or I'm in this camp and I only believe it's about social conflict. I think that's a false dichotomy, but historically it's often been almost like choosing a political party, like you have to belong to one or the other. So we see the idea that certain thinkers tend to focus much more on individual agency and how people can change society, and others are much more emphasizing the role of social structure. So there's clearly problems with both if you take them to their extremes. And in that post from last week, they look at that idea of, if you just say, I think we can just look at this for a moment. If I just say it's about the individual, that's patently false, because as an individual, I'm influenced by where I was born, the time I was born in, the economics situation of my family, my race, my gender. All of these things will contribute to how I move through the world as an individual. And so to just say it's up to the individual, which there are, obviously, we know these people. There are lots of people that believe this to be true, that it's all, up by your bootstraps and it's all about the individual's will, which of course is completely being blind to all of these other factors that influence somebody. So if we take it too far, that's a problem. But if we go to the other side and say it's just about social structure, which is more the Marxist way of looking at it, it kind of removes the individual from the equation. So for most of us, just intuitively, that doesn't seem right either, that we're just determined by social structure and the situation that we find ourselves in. So to me, logically, that's a kind of a dialectic, that there's a third position, that we're influenced by both, and that all people are kind of in this, you could call it a creative tension of how much agency do I have as an individual, and how much is am I coming up against the limits imposed by my social class or imposed by the country in which I live. So if my country is going through a violent civil war, that's going to obviously impact everything, from my family to my job prospects to everything. So I think this is an interesting question, and maybe I'll pose it on the discussion boards. That's probably a good way to get at this. of what you think about that, of how much of it is individual versus social structure. But certainly what I find so attractive about sociology in general is that it's looking at the whole group, and not just at the individual. But we can discuss that.